and welcome back to another Perspectives chat for whatever falls across my radar. And I was just thinking the other day back to an essay that I wrote and published last year at the end of 2021, which I called The 11th Hour. And it was referring to this age of deep materialism. And when civilization reaches a form of its deep materialism, then it indicates that there's a further separation from the essential nature of human civilization to its being or to its vital energies, and it's the separation shows that it's further away to therefore closer to a point of collapse. It's in its declining stage, and deep materialism is a stage that shows that civilization is coming to the end of a cycle. Um, and it also coincides with something that I wrote about in a book called New Revolutions for a Small Planet. This book was published in 2012, so it was written around 2010, 2011, where I talked about that humanity is going to experience collectively a dark night of the soul, so to speak, which is a kind of religious terminology for the the period of deep internal struggle and deep internal challenges and questioning and internal chaos before one can pull out of that and reach a kind of epiphany or revelation. So it's a time of deep inner turmoil before the revelation occurs. The dark night of the soul. You could also refer to it as the underworld journey, which I referenced in the previous video on the metaverse being a kind of underworld journey. And so I, in that essay, The 11th Hour, I actually quoted a passage that I've written in my book, New Revelations for a Small Planet. And I'm going to go to that now. Because it says that at such time of materialism, of course, that symbolizes that humankind has reached a limit of extremity from its essential nature, from its center of the sacred home, and that can be seen as the 11th hour, or rather a decisive moment before a dramatic turn of events in the course of that civilization. And I called it the dark night of the soul. So here's a quote to a passage that I wrote around 2010, 2011. We have now entered the crisis window, the transition phase, that heroic journey in the underworld, where we will be forced to experience a shamanic initiatory experience, perhaps a near-death experience, before we can emerge as an adolescent species with a new, more mature mind. Until we reach that stage, however, we will have to struggle with the death throes of the old mind, as old systems cling to power and global infrastructures attempt to remain in control of a world in transition, which is the dark passage that we are now venturing into. This is part of our collective rites of passage. It will shake us, reshuffle and reorientate a great deal of life on the planet. And it will also, hopefully, catalyze and prepare us for a psychophysical transformation. The reorientation required, both psychological and physical, may be far from linear, as we wrestle with the cloak of the old world system that clings onto a modus operandi, refusing to let go without a fight. Despite our glorious, gleaming, polished achievements that the world displays with pride, our current systems, social, cultural, political, and economic, are remarkably anachronistic, cunningly deceptive, opaque, and in dire need of renovation. Yet in order to sweep out the brushwood, we may be forced to endure a metaphorical and literal dark night of the soul. The next 20 years cannot be the same as the last 20 years. Change is upon us rapidly, even if we are not aware of its pace. I have to say, probably looking back on that, written 11 or 12 years ago, is quite prescient. And as I said at the end of that, the next 20 years cannot be the same as the last 20 years. There has to be rapid change. And that change has obviously come upon us now. And I think those metaphorical, maybe not as metaphorical as they seem when I wrote it, that rites of passage, the dark night of the soul, is what's occurring now. We are going through a rites of passage. We are being challenged and tested to see what will be our choices in these times, to what state of the human condition and humanity are we going to invest in and support. As I mentioned before, the organic human model, which I support, or the kind of transhumanist resetting of the human being. And so it seems that could be in play now. And so this dark night of the soul in such a moment is necessary, or rather it's inevitable. When it arrives, it has to be faced and worked through. It is a rites of passage. But in order to work through it, in order to a new kind of transforming to emerge. But in the dark night of the soul, it depends on how the human being is transfigured. And that's why it's important the choices we make or how receptive we are to what's going on. What I mean by that is the transfiguration. It can be worked with through the human being, through a state of being. And a transfiguration is a process that results in a kind of elevated condition of the human being. It's a transfiguration. It creates an elevated or a revelatory result at the end. The person has been transformed in a constructive way. But at the same time, the dark night of the soul can produce disempowered individuals. You can shy away from the aspects that are in the dark night. You cannot face them. And I know that some forms of psychology talk about facing the shadow, facing the wound. There's the choice that we don't face it, and the choice is that to run for security, false security that is being offered to us by the incumbent systems. And that choice of running away from facing and dealing with our own issues, or looking at how we can be resilient and emerging from this a better person, is a much different choice in this 11th hour than putting off our own responsibility and wishing for an external body or an external authority to provide a false security for us. And those choices will depend on how individuals are transfigured through this dark night of the soul, or become further disempowered and enslaved or blocked in this time. And similarly, this process is also one that was part of the mystery school's initiation phase. In the ancient mystery schools, the initiates, or those who chosen to go through the process, were put through quite challenging tests or challenging circumstances that were created to test their ability to deal with these challenges as a force of character, and how they responded, whether through fear or through facing these aspects. And they were put in a condition where they were put in great fear, or fearing fear. That's another element. It doesn't have to be fear, but the fear of the unknown. And these initiates who ran away from the fear of the unknown obviously were thrown out of the mystery schools. And it had to be almost a fear of your death, a fear of the potentiality of your death, not knowing perhaps that the symbolism behind that was the process of to die before you die, the death of your false self, the persona, all those social trappings and conditionings that had been clinging to the person. And it is said that at the end of this initiatory process, the light would emerge. The initiate would see the light at midnight, as it was phrased, the light within the darkness. So we could also include this in this 11th hour kind of understanding or framing of these times, whereby in this dark night of the soul, so to speak, there has to be this process to reach the sun at midnight, the light in the end of this process. So, so from that, if I'm looking down here, because I keep looking at the screen, it's like I need someone to talk to, but of course the camera's up there. So I should be looking up there, but it's like I prefer to have someone to talk with. So again, I would say that in these moments when, let's say, if we come through these times and we are not changed, we have not made those observations of ourselves, we have not responded to the times with our being, but rather through the false self, the persona, then if we come through these times not totally changed, not transfigured, as they would say, then you haven't really come through the initiatory process. And so I would say similarly in these times that if we respond to events that's happening in the world, events to life around us, if we respond just from a kind of superficial persona, from our social conditioning, then we not allowing any real internal change to come about. And if no real internal change has come about, then at the end of the day, we may have a different world external to us, but have we changed? And the 11th hour, this dark night of the soul, is there for that very reason, to create change within people, to create transfiguration within the human being, so the human being is at the stage where they can then be at a state where they are create the new state of the world around them. And that's the I'm not going to edit this, so you're going to get all this in with the talk to make it as original as it is. So if we get a new culture, new form of society at the end of this process we're going through, but the human being hasn't changed, then what are we getting? What has been the advancement? We're gaining a culture, a society, which has been changed perhaps by the few. But if humanity hasn't been changed, or has been stopped or slowed down from their own change, or has been persuaded to only change superficially, then we don't get civilizational advancement. We get another form of the status quo, looking like, or again using that term, a mimicry of how things were before, a mimicry of a new future. But humanity has not gone through the transfiguration. There needs to be a shift in the beingness of human beings at this time, so they are, humanity is the next stage, rather than a mimicry culture creating the next stage for the same conditioned humanity to be pulled into. And as they say, like, can the fish's philosophy understand the amphibian? That's kind of using an evolutionary kind of metaphor. The fish that's in the water, the next stage, of course, is the amphibian to walk on the land. And they say, can the fish's mind, the fish's philosophy understand the amphibian? It's very difficult, because a state of consciousness which is not at the next state of consciousness cannot understand it. And so if we are throwing out all our ideas, our debates, our talks, our opinions, but it's the fish's philosophy, it's never going to understand the next state of consciousness of the amphibian, or where culture and human society needs to be. It's only when there's been a change internally that there can be an understanding, because that change, that internal change, is the first phase in where the human being needs to go. So that change itself can start to understand the change which it is becoming. So after all this talk, what I'm trying to say at these times is that it's a time to work on ourselves. It's a time to go inward, as it says, and to use these years to allow ourselves to develop internally and to observe our response and reaction to the changing world around us. And these next few years, this decade, especially from now to the end of this decade, 2030, is very important, I would say crucial, for the human being to develop internally, to develop its beingness. Because if it only stays within the superficial personality, the persona, the conditioning, then we are not going to be in a state for any new world at all, or new culture at all, or anything to come out of this. It is going to be the internally transfigured individual who's going to be ready for what is to come. So these are just some thoughts. I will post below a link to that essay, The 11th Hour. Maybe good to revisit that. So thanks for listening to this further continuation of just my thoughts that fall off the radar and I wish to share. So thanks for listening thus far. Until next time. Cheers.